A new study has come out about methane emissions from Canadian natural gas production and distribution. And the numbers are not pretty. They suggest that current methane emission data is out by a factor of 2. That means the methane emissions are actually twice as bad as we think they are. And that has all sorts of implications for the Canadian oil and gas industry. To discuss the study, we're going to be joined by Dale Marshall from Environmental Defense. So welcome to the interview, Dale.
Thanks, Markham. Good to be here.
Why don't we start with an overview of the study? Can you summarize it for us?
Yeah, essentially what the study did is it looked at 4 different sites in Alberta and Saskatchewan to try to come up with an estimate of what methane emissions might be from those sites, not based on some kind of factor, emissions factor from the equipment that's there, but actually measuring the emissions that come off the land through using a number of different data, but often using flyover methane measurements. And essentially what they did is they compared that to what the official reporting is for those sites, and essentially said that that as you mentioned, that the actual emissions are almost twice as high as the reported emissions. And what the report finds is that they think that a large portion of those are what they call fugitive emissions from these sites. So emissions that are through leaks, leaking oil tanks, they said, what quite possibly might be a major source. And those are not captured with respect to the official data that Canada has in its national inventory on greenhouse gases.
Now, this is important because methane emissions are important greenhouse gas, and the governments at both the provincial levels and the federal government are committed to reducing those by 40 to 45% within like 2025. We should also point out that emissions data has been very poor. The technology has only gotten better in the last few years, and companies have not had strict regulations on actually getting out and measuring. So a lot of this stuff is guesstimates, and now we're seeing studies like this one actually go out and measure it in the air, and we're getting different numbers than what we had. So on that note, I want to provide some data for our viewers from the Canadian Energy Research Institute 2018 study on methane emissions from the Canadian natural gas supply chain. So it's upstream in production, midstream in distribution, downstream in processing. They are eye-opening, folks. So in BC, where you have 5 billion cubic feet a day of production, they estimate 2.2 megatons of emission per year. In Alberta, where you have double the production, 10 billion cubic feet a day, the emissions are 24.5 megatons. That's like a factor of 6 or 7 times more. In Saskatchewan, where you have 400,000 cubic feet of production a day, 16 megatons. I mean, that's just like off the charts. So given that context, Dale, I think the government and the industry has a much bigger job ahead than they thought they did.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what we need to figure out more before we actually ensure that we meet these targets is ensure we know what the emissions are. And you know, you talked about the Series study, the study that just came out recently that was put together undertaken by a bunch of scientists at Environment and Climate Change Canada. But there have been a series of these kinds of reports that have essentially all shown the same thing, which is emissions are higher than ones that are being reported. And it really doesn't matter what the methodology is, what the geographic area is, what the kind of oil and gas facility it is. What's in our inventory in terms of greenhouse gases underestimates the true nature of the problem. And so we really do need to come to grips with that. And I say we, the Canadian government needs to, and the Alberta government and the Saskatchewan government, we need to come to grips with exactly what the data is. And once we have a firm grip on that we're pretty sure, it's always going to be an estimate, but we're much closer to actual emissions, then we can put into place the kinds of regulations that are going to have to be stronger, to deal with those higher emissions, and ensure that we're actually meeting the targets, meeting the commitments that we made to reduce emissions, as you say, by 40 to 45% by 2025.
Now, here's one of the most telling comments or responses to that study that really put it into perspective for me, and that is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Canada's largest lobby group for the hydrocarbon sector, did not dispute the study. And I think that's very telling. They get it, that this is a much worse problem than we had previously thought. So let's talk about emissions regulations. And this is really an issue, because in BC, they came up with a regulatory regime that was fairly robust, and Ottawa recognized it as equivalent. They recognized it as meeting their standards for hitting climate targets. The Kenney government came in and put together a very weak sauce kind of set of emission regulations that were not accepted. The federal government said no. They had to go back to the table, and it looks like the emissions that Alberta and Canada recently agreed to are a compromise. They're a kind of a middle ground, not as good as they should be, and that raises the question: are they not then completely inadequate, given the new data we have?
Well, they are inadequate, and Environment and Climate Change Canada knows that. Its own assessment of what the federal regulations will achieve in terms of emission reductions and what the provincial regulations will achieve in terms of emission reductions, those are pretty close to each other, but all of them are too weak. They only will achieve 29%. This is according to ECCC data. They will only achieve 29% reductions when the target for 2025 is 40 to 45%, which is why environment groups like Environmental Defense and others were pushing the federal government to strengthen their regulations, ask the provinces to then strengthen theirs before coming to agreements about having the provincial regulations apply. And yet we weren't listened to. Last week, the federal government signed off on those agreements. And then 4 days later, this study comes out that is, once again, authored by scientists who work for Environment and Climate Change Canada, saying emissions are close to twice as high as what is in the report, is what we're reporting officially. So, I mean, we really do need to be taking this issue seriously, because there are some really good reasons to, right? Methane reductions are really cheap. They're really feasible. The technologies are there. It means jobs, and in an economic recovery, having people on sites looking for leaks, having people switching out equipment from high emitting to zero emitting, all those things will create jobs. So there are lots of really good reasons to be moving forward on this more ambitiously.
Let's tie a bow around this conversation with this point, Dale. We know that the threshold for comparing for natural gas if you burn it and create electricity with it, the threshold for being better than coal is 3% methane emission leakage. That's the rate. So BC's rate is 0.3. It's 1/10 of that threshold. Alberta's, as it stands in the CIRI report, is right around 3. Now, if the rate now is double what we previously had thought, that means that the leakage rate in Alberta is now around 6%. And that completely undercuts Premier Kenney and the industry's claims of creating green LNG to send off to China to displace coal in their power plants. It would actually be worse, or potentially worse. And so there's that angle has not been explored enough publicly, because this has severe consequences for both federal policy, which supports LNG, and also Alberta's very, very aggressive push on the green LNG front.
Yeah, I mean, that whole chain has been put into question in terms of the emissions that come from the production of frack gas, the LNG, the liquefaction process, sending it overseas. Whether it is in fact displacing coal is another big question, because China is moving very aggressively to replace coal with renewables as well. And this obviously puts a really big question mark on that issue, even more so because, like you say, if the emissions of methane from these kinds of operations, both the production and the transport of methane, are that high, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, as we know, almost 100 times stronger than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. If all of that is true, and the science seems to be suggesting it is, then it really does put a big question about the environmental integrity, the environmental value of turning natural gas into LNG and sending it anywhere.
Dale, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. And I will be discussing this issue again, because I think this study is going to put the natural gas methane emissions on the public, put it into the public conversation in a way it hasn't been before.
Great. Well, thanks for your interest, Mark, and take care.